My name's Leonard. I work for a company called Reinteractive. We build web apps for people. Recently in Sydney we've been doing this thing called InstallFest, where I wrote the material and I help run it. It's a monthly thing where we've helped approximately 20 people install Rails, build a blog from scratch and deploy it onto Roku. So far this year we've introduced over 100 people to Ruby on Rails, and there should be an InstallFest running here in Melbourne on October 15th. For those of you who signed up through meetup.com, it's in the same group, so you can just check that out there. Reinteractive's community manager, Chloe, who's standing over there, will probably message the people who have come through meetup.com to sort of try to prompt you to go to InstallFest. I think it's pretty cool, but obviously I'm really biased. One of the more common questions that we get is, what the hell do you do after you've done InstallFest or the 15-minute blog or something similar? What resources are good? What should you be focusing on? And all those sorts of things. So, the first step is you're going to be doing a lot of learning. There's a lot of things to learn. If you're going to become a programmer, you're going to spend your entire life learning things, so get used to it. If it's not your thing, then probably stop straight away. I'm sorry. But if you really love learning, then continue on, because programming is freaking amazing and you get to spend your entire life solving interesting problems and learning cool stuff. Okay, so first of all, I'd say that you should be learning Ruby as opposed to focusing on Ruby on Rails. The reason being is that Ruby on Rails is based on the Ruby programming language. And if you don't learn Ruby first, you're going to be spending a lot of time going, what the hell is this magic thing that Rails is doing for me? And this is probably the mistake I made when I tried to learn Rails several times back when it was a long time ago. It wasn't until I actually decided to grow some backbone and actually just learn Ruby that I finally cracked it and learned Rails as well. Second thing is, you should learn some HTML, you should learn some CSS, maybe a bit of JavaScript, because ultimately you want to build websites, and Rails is just a fancy way of concatenating strings together to send them over the internet. Finally, don't be overwhelmed by all the different things that you have to learn. There's a lot of things to learn, but you can just approach things step by step at a time, and there'll be a lot of help for you along the way. I want to emphasize that if you're new, and if you can remember one of those people who was standing up before and you don't know what you're doing, just go up to one of those people who are standing up and ask them for help. I probably guarantee you they're going to give you some help. But if they don't give you any help, you can contact me. My Twitter's just there, or you can just post up on there's a Rails Oceania Google group. You could post there, you could go to a bunch of different stuff. I'm going to get to that later. Okay, so once you've done the 15-minute blog, you may be like, that's really cool, but I don't want to build a blog. I want to build something else. And something else looks nothing like a blog. I'm here to tell you that everything else looks exactly like a blog. Once you understand how to abstract out the concepts you've learned from the blog. So, the important thing that you need to understand is that a blog is effectively just a way of displaying your articles or your posts. And almost every other app is the same. So if you think about Twitter, the tweet is the main thing. In fact, Twitter's sort of like a blogging engine. But let's say a timesheet application. Everything revolves around the entry, the timesheet entry, or maybe the collection of entries, which is like the sheet for the week or something like that. It's common for systems to have one or maybe two things that are the main things in the application. If you've got more than that, you're doing it wrong, particularly for your first app. One of the common mistakes I still make as an experienced developer is that I try to start things that have too many main concerns with the application. If you're starting something and you're concerned about more than one or two things, you should need to scale it back and focus on what the one or two things are. So just as another example, you might be building a forum application, maybe like Discourse. So you're going to have topics and you're going to have comments. Both of those things can be interacted with in exactly the same way that you interact with your post or your article in your blog. So my advice to anyone starting out is to build your Rails app and think about what the main concern or the main thing that you're doing in the Rails app. So in the blog, it was your post or your article. In Discourse, it's like a topic or a comment or something similar like that. Okay, so the next part is you've just got to build your thing, and it actually doesn't matter because you should just build anything. So when you're starting out, you should just start by doing whatever code you possibly can, because every bit of code that you write will be a learning experience and that will be valuable. If you don't know what to work on, and I never do, you can force yourself, grow some discipline, and do everything, every exercise in ruby.railstutorial.org. Or maybe if you just want to learn Ruby itself, you could do Project Euler, which is a fantastic way of learning a new programming language. And you just do like mathematical problems that are sometimes really, really hard maths, but you know, using a programming language, which is really cool. If you really, really don't know how to get started, perhaps you should ignore Rails for a little bit and focus on just building like some HTML mockups. Build a really ugly mockup, don't care about how it looks, but it'll give you a bit of a better idea on what you should be doing with your application. If you need to do something really, really simple, maybe consider not using Rails at all and using something like Sinatra instead. Sinatra is a really super simple way of building like maybe a very simple web application. This is particularly appropriate for someone coming from maybe PHP. It'll make a lot more sense to you, and you'll be able to do all the horrible things you can do in PHP, but using Ruby instead, which makes it like a million times better. If you're really, really struggling, you can just sketch a mock-up on paper or using a tool like Balsamiq, and then you can try to identify what your main concern is. You could take that sketch to someone who actually knows what they're doing and say, please, can you just help me out with this? I'm trying to figure out what my deal is. And as I said before, if you're trying to figure out something, if you're trying to deal with a problem that's got like lots of different moving parts, just don't. If you're starting out, just don't try to build anything complicated. Okay, so the next part is, and I touched on this a little bit earlier, please ask for help. Please, please ask for help. This community is really awesome. I've been part of, not maybe the Melbourne community, but the Sydney community for a while, and I know a lot of the people in the room, and everyone's really lovely and is more than willing to help out. It is true that sometimes it's frustrating for a mentor to be asked questions that are like easily Googleable, and I'd really like for mentors to try to hold back their desire to like say, just Google it or something like that, or you read the fucking manual, because that's often, like, I mean, yes, that's helpful in a way, but often the person asking the question doesn't know what to Google or doesn't know what manual to read. So rather than saying, just Google it, I like to say, have you tried Googling for, and then give them the exact phrase in Google to search for instead. That way you teach them two things. You teach them what phrase is useful, and you also teach them that they can use Google to search for something. And you'd be surprised about how many people just don't know that you can just Google things. For all the newbies out there, the most important thing I want to say is you should not be afraid to ask for help. Don't be worried about the way you ask for help. But if you want to get the best help, if you want to ask a really good question, then you should try to research your question as much as possible. Try to Google it first. Try to take the code that you have written and put it up on gist.github.com, and try to share as much of your code as possible with the person you're asking. And that way, you know, they'll be able to help you out as much as possible. There are a bunch of different ways you can get help. So you can come to something like this. You can get a beer from the fridge for someone and say, please help me, and they might help you. You could also try something like Stack Overflow. Personally, I don't like it, but a lot of people love getting like many, many points from it. You could just jump onto IRC. If you go to Freenode and the Ruby on Rails channel, there are people in there like 24/7 who, for some bizarre reason, will help you out. There is also a Roro channel as well, which you could ask like people who are in this room for help as well, but like online. You could go to something like InstallFest. You could go to Development Hub, which is another thing in Sydney that I'm hoping will come here. You could go to a hack night. You can ask like my Twitter or like Twitter of random people in the room maybe. Yeah. So hopefully as you go on, all of this starts to crystallize into something a little bit better, and then you can start to become a Rails programmer.